My name is Stephen Dandin. I'm the Executive Director of the Reinvention Collaborative, and I welcome all participants to today's town hall, which, as you see with the title slide, is entitled Structural Barriers to Student Success, Advancing Educational Equity Through Improved Measurement of Undergraduate Experiences and Outcome. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Richard Arum, who is Professor of Education and by courtesy also Professor of Sociology, Criminology, Law and Society, as well as Dean of the School of Education at the University of California, Irvine, and also Dr. Michael Dennin, who is Professor of Physics and Astronomy, as well as Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning and Dean of the Division of Undergraduate Education, also at the University of California, Irvine. Gentlemen, welcome and thank you for your time.
Steve, it's great to be here. Thank you for having us. I noticed the attendees are still kind of coming in, but I think we'll go ahead and start. I'm going to just make a few quick framing remarks. As Steve mentioned, our main goal is to do a dialogue between Richard and myself and you, the audience. We are going to be talking about some challenging issues. This is at its core about institutional racism. And Richard and I want to acknowledge at the beginning, we're coming from this as two white men who have experienced privilege in this space. But both of us believe it's the responsibility of all educators at this moment in time to ask these questions, really interrogate how higher education structures contribute to an inequality and where we need to move to really achieve equity and inclusive excellence. It's a very challenging conversation, and we may make mistakes and missteps. I think we all probably will along the way. And that's why it needs to be a conversation really among all of us. And so what Richard and I hope to represent here a little bit is what's happening at UCI between research and implementation. Richard from the School of Ed representing research and myself representing implementation from the Vice Provost office, but that's not a hard and fast line. I mean, research and implementation happens in many spaces. And so I'm going to briefly share my screen.
And Michael, I can jump in while you're
and say a few
doing
quick
that. Just
things.
say one thing. It's particularly important for us to interrogate higher education, we believe. Higher education is where 50% of students that start a degree don't finish. And the outcomes in terms of learning and their indicators of student success are really problematic. So it's not enough just to kind of keep pointing downward at K-12 education. We really have to own that there's something about how higher education itself is structured that requires us to interrogate and work to improve it as well.
Exactly. And what we want to do, I mean, we only have an hour and this is a big space, and we acknowledge that a large space of this, there's a lot of really positive, useful discussion around the students, taking a strengths-based view, interrogating their preparation. And as Richard said, we can't really continue to put the blame on K through 12. We need to focus on our structures and get student input. There's also a large space of research on what's happening in the individual courses with instructors, inclusive teaching, and evidence-based practices. Both of these are critical and important parts of what we need to be doing. But what we'd like to focus on today really is the institutional level, the culture, structures, and data that can help us at that level. And even there, I made these very large circles on purpose. We're not even going to be able to touch on all of the institutional level. We would like to propose focusing on three sort of areas for discussion. So again, these are not representative of everything that needs to be interrogated. But we'll start with a little bit what I frame as shifting our culture from being predominantly one where we identify, certify, label students as excellent and graduate them versus creating opportunities for students to maximize their potential. And we might consider this as a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Lately, I've liked to use the phrase, universities do tend to produce people who are excellent at things. These are sufficient conditions for excellence. We often, as faculty and institutions, treat them as necessary and say any change to what we do would lower standards is our fear. And that to me is a confusion between sufficient and necessary conditions for excellence. And we can come back to that. The other topic is really the very large area of grading versus authentic assessment, and the structural inequities that are built into how we think about grading, how we do grading, and how grading works. And then finally, really, how do we leverage institutional data, both to support the cultural changes we need to make, identify the changes we need to make, and then support student success. So we just wanted to give the audience kind of a sense of the three topics we'd like to cover. I will re-emphasize as I stop sharing here, what Steve said. We look forward to questions being posted in the chat throughout, and in the question and answer phase. So that's where we're going.
And we're going to structure this as more of a dialogue than a lecture. We think that that's probably the lecture format is tough enough in a large lecture hall. It works even less well in a Zoom setting. And so, Michael, let me start off just with asking you to speak a little bit more. You've talked in discussions, we often talk about your concern that the university is taking on the role of enforcer of standards, rather than focusing on growth and development. What do you mean by that?
So I think it's easiest if I focus in on two specific examples, and I like to be ecumenical here and try and pick two examples that cover the whole university experience. I will say, when you look at the data, often STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, my area of the campus gets highlighted. But when you think about the academic standards, and what I hear from my colleagues in my role as vice provost so often is students can't do math, usually calculus, or students can't write. And our colleagues rightfully appreciate the academic essay, for lack of a better word, and appreciate the ability to do calculus the way they did when they went through the system. And I think these are two great examples of my comment of sufficient versus necessary conditions for excellence. It is certainly true, being able to write a well-crafted academic essay is an example of excellence. And being able to solve a calculus problem by hand, doing all the steps of algebra by hand, is an example of excellence. But they aren't the only way to be excellent. And they're often not really what we are talking about our higher goals. We will use phrases like being able to, solve open-ended problems, do critical analysis, and communicate. And there's a wide range of powerful ways to communicate after you've done a very in-depth, insightful, critical analysis of a piece. And our colleagues are often struggling with, well, the student seemed to understand and do the analysis, but their writing was horrible. So what grade should I give them? And suddenly your 18 years of experience beforehand, whether you were privileged to learn how to write an academic essay before you got here or not, is a big factor in your grade, which then impacts what you look like to the world on the other side. And the same happens in STEM. We often, are you fast and quick at doing a calculation, or have we acknowledged that the computer exists and can do a lot of that work for you? And what you are really creative at observing and taking in broader pieces of information. And so what have been good proxies for excellence are becoming barriers, I think, to students, because there are only acceptance of excellence too often, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and the way that the assessments themselves are structured, I know you have great concern that the way the items themselves are constructed, the forms of the assessments can do little more than certify pre-existing differences rather than really focus on learning. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I think one of the things that's interesting, and we have to acknowledge, these are very challenging things. And I think one of the big things to acknowledge up front among all of us and in the conversations is, what are the challenges? What are we going to give up? What are the pain points? And when you look at our assessments, many of them have evolved to work at scale. And because of that, there are many people out there talking about and pointing out how we then end up assessing and grading for the lower order skills, because that's just how the two go together. And, you know, some of the challenges in the assessment space, you know, we're seeing problems with, if it's a single high stakes exam, right? The sort of stereotype threat, and other issues that come in to that. When people curve, you know, and you grade on a strict curve and students know only a certain percent are going to get an A's, now it's fundamentally a competition, and people who are used to learning collaboratively don't have that opportunity to really engage in the learning fully with their colleagues in the way you'd want students to be discussing. I already mentioned, I think, some of the challenges with assessing only through an academic essay is the mode of communication. Can the communication mode sometimes override the actual analysis, or, you know, other competencies the students were having and experiencing? And to me, I think, you know, I go back to you, Richard, and some of the work you've done on developing really clear learning outcomes, and really asking the question, what do we want students to have out the other end? Do we want them to just kind of get a top off experience where they came in already excellent at X, Y, and Z? We expose them to some more content and we certify and acknowledge. Or are we really about taking the student who has a passion for what we want to do, had a different 18 years of experience than we designed the university for, and really figure out a way to be honest about, okay, if our goal is partly academic writing, let's give you the full 4 years to get there. How would we assess that? I'm admitting I don't have easy answers for this because they're hard problems, but I think we can get more creative in this space. And like I said, I don't know if you want to comment briefly, some of the work you've done in the past on learning outcomes, and actually embracing those versus just listing them, but then grading content, I think is key.
Yeah, so when I was at the Social Science Research Council, we worked with a half dozen or so of the national disciplinary associations to convene faculty panels, experts in teaching and learning within their disciplines about what the 21st century learning outcomes should look like. And across every discipline, faculty said very clearly, we have to move away from surface content knowledge. We have to figure out what are the larger concepts, disciplinary concepts and competencies that we're trying to develop, and then build in assessments that measure the development of these concepts and competencies that are really going to position people for success. The content knowledge we can all get on our phones today, right?
Oh yeah, and I think it also goes to, not only can we get it on our phones, I really would encourage faculty to embrace our core principles that we repeat, and then I have to admit, are hard often to implement when we actually get to the nuts and bolts, which is, we claim we want to teach people to learn. But when you get down to it, when you talk to faculty about, oh, adding active learning or improving this or that, it often happens that the nuts and bolts force content to be considered to be removed, and faculty love their content for very good reasons. It's exciting stuff. It's stuff we often discovered. And I get the passion around content. But one thing I thought about is a structural thing that we could think about is, what if teaching was more about the department's teaching mission and less about whether individual faculty were good at it? And what I mean by that is, you could even make it, I'm going to get really scary here for any of the people who are department chairs. Part of their budget, right? Part of the department budget could depend not just on the number of student credit hours, but a measure of the quality of their teaching mission. But if you did that, and say a department articulated 6 of these learning outcomes you mentioned, Richard, right, that are across the curriculum, and in every given course, instead of just getting a letter grade, the faculty member also maybe gave you exceeds, meets, doesn't meet, or not applicable to my course, because not every learning outcome will be in every course, but most will. And then at the end of 4 years, as long as somewhere along the line you meet or exceed the learning outcome, that gets reported to the next stage, whether it's a potential employer or grad school or whatever. So you have a way of tracking this without actually doing additional assessment. It's just in the work of the course, the assessments you naturally give, you mark for the competencies. And this is basically what engineering's had to do with ABET.
Yeah, it, I think you're absolutely right, Michael, but it also requires the departments to be more intentional about structuring the curriculum. So not only just building in authentic assessments all the way through, but there has to be some sort of logical sequence that's building these concepts and competencies throughout the program. And when we worked with these expert faculty groups from the National Disciplinary Associations, what was very clear was that in some fields like STEM, there's a clear introductory course and a clear sequence that follows. In others, like sociology, my own discipline, it's usually a requirement that students often take introduction to sociology in their senior year to finish the major. They can get in other ways. There's no prerequisites. Right. And in other fields like history, there was no introductory course at all. Right. It could be US history, it could be world history, it could be a range. And so it's hard to expect students to develop these concepts and competencies when we're not doing the job of being intentional and sequencing the learning. I'm going to go to a question because, and this also will encourage people to write questions. The first one came up around the pandemic and concerns about academic rigor. And so, there's also, when you're saying we shouldn't be the enforcer of standards, I know you often, we get pushback on campus. Are you telling me not to be academically rigorous?
Right.
What do you tell faculty to kind of help them think through how academic rigor isn't the enforcement of arbitrary and arbitrary standards that disproportionately affect certain students?
Yeah, and so I think the first step in that is to remind faculty, and it's never been it'll never be my goal to lower standards or rigor. I always talk about it as having broader standards, not lower standards. And there's two specific things I like to point out. First of all, we have to really let go of this feeling that somehow a grade distribution reflects academic rigor in a course. And I think the easiest counterexample for me is always to point out any course that curves, which I don't believe in curving, and I think you can really make good arguments against it. But many of our colleagues curve, and many of the justification is, that this keeps the course rigorous. If there's 20% A's or whatever it is, 15% A's, B's, C's, and so on down the line. But you immediately realize that as soon as, you're curving, all that you need on the other side of that is some way to get different points to different students. And then you're gonna get a certain number of A, B, C's, D's, and F's. And there's absolutely no connection of any of that to the rigor of the course. And it can be all over the place. The other thing I point out, I've had personal experience, and I know one data point and anecdotes don't really determine things, but winter quarter, I was teaching the follow-on to the first quarter of physics for the pre-meds at our university. And I actually ended up giving mostly A's and B's, and I use an absolute grading scale. And first I panicked. Did I get too easy? Was I not rigorous enough? And when I realized, I looked at it, my course had accidentally been scheduled at 8 in the morning. And from the fall quarter, I had about 400 students. I had the larger section. We usually have a 400 and a 200 person section. In the winter quarter, I ended up with the 200 person section. Why? It was 8 in the morning. Who signed up with me? All the students who got an A and B from me in the first quarter, and then those who couldn't get into the other. So I had this essentially top heavy class, and the high number of A's and B's had no relation to the rigor of my course. It reflected the quality of the students in there. And I think this is why learning outcomes and assessment is such an important discussion, right? The rigor of a course comes from the overall design and structure and what you're asking students to do, and is appropriate, I think, for the material at hand, the level of the students, and where you are in your goals. If you don't know your goals and objectives critically and super clearly, you're not going to be able to define rigor. And, for the pandemic, I really hope, but look, our colleagues are under a lot of different pressures. Nobody is finding the pandemic easy. and it's a struggle for many ways. But as we have time and we move out of it, what I'm kind of hoping is something that can emerge is a realization that we didn't have a good idea of rigor beforehand. We weren't really explicit about it. We were using proxies that may have worked at one time and don't really work now. And so we need to kind of move past that. And really, I think the answer is, have you designed a structurally reasonable course based on evidence-based pedagogy, right? It's the structure of the course that's ultimately where rigor comes from, not the grades that come out the other side.
Right. Rigor has to be something that is tracking our ability to have all students learn, and all students learn at great enough rates that their investment in time is warranted. Rigor can't be the students that are leaving the major because you've given them a D, F,
Right.
or they've withdrawn or incompletes, nor the 50% of students that end up not finishing their degrees. That can't be a measure of rigor by any reasonable definition.
No, I always go back to my time as a youth soccer coach, right? The rigor of my coaching was not that I drove kids to hate soccer and leave, right? But my practice is, one of the greatest compliments I ever got as a soccer coach is that consistently parents recognize that I really push the kids to their limits in many ways while maintaining it as something that was fun and enjoyable, so that they would leave with a passion for soccer, a passion for exercise. Even if they didn't play soccer their whole life, they understood the value of being athletic, getting out there and doing stuff, being outside. And they appreciated that hard work was necessary to get better, but hard work could bring rewards and be fun. So there's a deep relation between hard work and fun that I think is often overlooked. They're not mutually exclusive. And other people might use different words than hard work and fun, but rigor is not about making people hate it and leave. As you said, Richard, it's about engaging their passion and helping them work through the material to the best that they can.
Yeah, and part of rigor also has to be, one would imagine, the preparation of faculty as instructors, and that goes to the top question.
The top question at the moment. I saw that. Yeah.
And Michael, you're perfect to answer that, because one of the things I'm very proud about and been impressed at UCI, Michael, is all you've stood up on campus around the promotion of pedagogical professional development, promotion of active learning. You want to speak a little bit to the institution's responsibility to make sure that all faculty have the tools and the preparation to be successful?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I'll just say real briefly, it's many of my colleagues out there on the call, I saw many names I recognize. I can make them jealous. It makes your job a little easier as a vice provost of teaching and learning when you open a roughly $60 million building devoted to active learning classrooms. And the provost says, yes, you can make it priority scheduling if people actually have training in active learning. That helps to have that brand new,
some incentives.
Right, it is. So it goes to this idea that incentives do matter. But it also helps. I will say something really good about UCI and the UC system in general, but UCI, we've really embraced it. And Diane O'Dowd, our colleague who's vice provost of academic personnel, I got to give a shout out to her. Our professor of teaching track has turned out to be very useful in this space for seeding the idea that pedagogical techniques matter, evidence-based teaching matters. And you can see that culture slowly growing in the university, which allows us in the equivalent of our Teaching and Learning Center, which is the Division of Teaching Excellence and Innovation, to really leverage those faculty as partners in the training and propagation of these. And I want to quickly go to the one that's now the highest, the tenure and promotion, and make just a quick comment in that space. for my whole career, but definitely the last 5 years as a vice provost, I hear over and over, if we don't change the tenure and promotion piece, we're never going to motivate the change in teaching, particularly at R1 universities. And this is why I'm really excited about the idea of centering the evaluation of teaching at the department level for a couple of reasons. You don't remove the individual responsibility. You still review individual faculty for their contribution, what I would say, to the department's teaching mission, which involves their individual teaching. But it forces, I think, or encourages, forces is too strong a word, encourages departments to really articulate what is their teaching mission in the context of being a Research One university. Almost every department on my campus, I would suspect this is not very different from other R1s. Almost every department has a strategic research mission articulated at some level. If for no other reason, they have to get resources from their dean or the provost or someone equivalent. I would argue very few of us have a strategic teaching mission articulated clearly in the context and balance of our research mission. And that departments are really the unit, I think, that's the right place to have that discussion and hold each of us accountable for the teaching. Because let's face it, if part of the department's budget depended on teaching excellence, I think we would have very robust conversations among our colleagues as to how we're all contributing and what we're doing and how we need to do that. So, and that is also one of the only ways to get at these structural issues, right? To have the honest, hard conversations about how is our grading, how is our view of excellence, how is our view of rigor, creating structural barriers to our students, whether they're students of color, whether it's a gender, whether it's ethnicity, social status, income, but these structural barriers are there. If we don't discuss them, we're not going to get rid of them. And we have to do that at the department level, I think.
Yes, so we're at the halfway mark. I was going to remind the audience, please put in questions Q and vote questions up and down so we can answer them. And then, Michael, I was going to suggest maybe we spend a few minutes showing 3 of the measurement slides.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect timing, Richard. So I'm going to share my screen again.
So one of the things that is somewhat unique at UCI is that Michael and I are partnering together to try to improve measurement and have measurement drive institutional improvement efforts. And so we want to tell you a little bit about this project that we launched. It built on some prior investments on campus, like the creation of a data warehouse and investment in other data infrastructure on campus. But about 2 years ago, Michael and I received an award from the Mellon Foundation to set up a pilot demonstration site at UCI for next generation undergraduate success measurement. And the goals of that project are three major goals. First, develop and disseminate new measures of undergraduate experiences and outcomes. Why new measures? Because we believe the existing measurement in higher education is inadequate for the task of understanding and addressing and improving student performance. It's not enough simply to track students over time and measure their grades and credit accumulation and attrition. It requires a much more highly developed, integrated data system. And every other sector in our society, from Amazon to the airplane industry, is using data to improve performance. We can no longer afford to be laggards in this area. The second goal is informing efforts to improve institutional performance and advance educational equity. So at the core, this project has been about improving practice and improving educational equity. It is not it's not set up simply to be a abstract academic research project. And then third, the goal is to promote deeper understanding of educational processes and identification of educational value. an educational value, particularly the Mellon Foundation was interested in around the value of liberal arts education broadly conceived. The data, so what's unique about the project is we have administrative data that we integrate from the entire campus. That includes college admissions data, data on the traditional data on grades and credit accumulation, also administrative data on every interaction that students have with student support services, academic advisors, academic tutoring, career service. So anything that's not health related, we integrate this data into our system. Next, we have a wealth of information from the learning management systems. We use Canvas on campus that many people or campuses are not taking adequate advantage of. And so we built a system so that for every student in every course, we have a measure of their academic engagement, as well as other interactions in the learning management systems, such as their interaction with peers, their interaction with faculty, their pacing and sequencing of their work. And so that data also is integrated with the administrative data. And then finally, we have added both performance assessments and student surveys. So students take surveys before they start the year, at the end of every term. We added additional surveys around COVID-19 and the response to remote instruction. And for a subsample of our student population, surveys are actually even administered weekly. And then for performance assessments, we built performance assessments with ETS to get at 21st century skills and competencies. And so we do use their off-the-shelf assessment, heightened assessment for critical thinking, but we built a series of new assessments, one on collaborative problem solving, one on perspective taking. Can you take the perspective and understand the perspective of someone different than you in a social interaction? And confirmation bias. Can you, if you're exposed to new information, can you change your mind, or is your preconceived opinion on something so rigid that it's unable to move and adapt? And then finally, with partnership with Sam Weinberg at Stanford University, we also assess students on online civic reasoning. Students are given something that they might be exposed to on Facebook or Twitter, and they're asked to make sense of it in terms of their reliability and validity. So our sample, we have in the administrative data and learning management systems is for the entire population of students at UCI, but then our performance assessments and weekly surveys are for a smaller subset. We followed freshmen and then our junior students over time. We started with about 1,200 last fall and watched them and followed them as they dealt with the pandemic and the move to remote instruction last spring. And then this fall, we are following a similar number that are basically starting UCI, the freshmen and the transfer juniors are starting UCI remotely. And so it's a very important group of students to track. Next slide, Michael.
There we go.
Thank you. And so quickly, just a little bit about our measurement framework. We're trying to measure student growth and development in a holistic way. So we're not interested simply in cognitive ability in terms of generic critical thinking, complex reasoning, and domain-specific growth of concepts and competencies within a major, but we also want to know about intellectual dispositions. Are they learning to have a hunger for additional information, an openness to new information, a sense of intellectual humility, where one isn't so certain of their own intellectual convictions that they're not willing to interrogate them and adapt to new information. We look at identity and life course agency, the extent to which students are able to develop sense of identity and adapt to the institution and adapt career goals and pathways. We look at self-regulation skills. We look at social capital, development of social networks and social relationships. We track civic engagement, psychological flourishing, and mental health. And then as we follow students over time, we'll be tracking their postgraduate outcomes, not just in terms simply of employment, but also in terms of graduate school, social and psychological outcomes, and civic outcomes. We have to, if this moment doesn't convince you of the importance of civic education, that we have to develop people to play productive roles as citizens in our society, I don't know anything that will convince you of that. Our democracy is dependent on our ability to provide education, not just for labor market success, but for these broader range of outcomes and civic outcomes in particular. Next slide, and then we'll go back to the Q&A. And so here, I just want to give you a little taste of what some of the measurement would look like. So and I know the fonts are really small, so don't panic here. I'll walk you through it. These are just examples. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you see a phone. And one of the methods we use is something called experiential sampling, where students are at random times during the day and during the semester are buzzed on their phone 50 times during during the year, and they're asked, what are you doing? Who are you doing it with? What is your emotional state at this time? And that information really will give us an authentic way to understand how students are experiencing undergraduate education at UCI. The middle image shows you this collaborative problem-solving assessment we built with ETS. Here, students are put in groups of 4 randomly in a virtual space. They're given a set of documents to think through and asked to solve a problem first individually. Then they are encouraged to interact with each other in the chat box and solve the problem collaboratively at the end. And so here you're able to see, are people able to end up with outcomes that collaboratively, but also you're able to track the process of collaborative problem solving in an authentic way by monitoring and coding and analyzing the interaction students are engaged in with the chat box. And then finally, some of the survey items. Here, again, some of the weekly surveys, we have everything from asking about their course and the way the course is connected to their future careers, to questions around experience of discrimination and microaggression on campus, and questions about their extracurricular activities, their mentoring, their internships, and so on. And again, all this data is integrated into a way where we can really have the ability to understand student experiences, student trajectories, and student outcomes. So let's go back to the Q&A. Thank you for a few minutes just to walk you through that system. Oh, and I should say one more thing before we jump back.
Yeah, while you talk, Richard, I'm going to read the questions and figure out what to ask you.
Great, thank you, Michael. So I'll say one other thing. This is a pilot demonstration project. The goal was for all of these techniques to be made available to the larger field of higher education for use on your own campus. So the surveys, we're going to publish them all. They were administered in Qualtrics. You could, if you chose, you'd be free to administer them on your own campus. Again, we're hoping that the measurement we're doing here can inspire other colleges and universities to improve on their measurement systems. I think the learning management systems data, it's very hard for all campuses to reproduce what we did at UCI, given the amount of investment it took. But what we're going to do there is we're going to encourage the LMS providers, Canvas, Blackboard, to build in these kind of measures and make them available to institutions that use their product. There's no reason that since it's simply, easy software algorithms that can be built into their software, they could generate this type of information to every campus to work to track academic engagement, interactions, peer interactions, interactions with faculty. So you can really understand how students are experiencing their undergraduate education.
So thank you, Richard. And I think what I'm going to try and do with a quick read is sort of synthesize two separate questions, because we are getting closer to the end of the time, that I think are related. One is, there's a lot of interest on this idea of, okay, GPAs, rigor, incentivizing faculty to move to a different measure. And a lot of the data seems to be quantitative data, but there's a real need for qualitative analysis of both student performance and surveys and data. So one way I might package this in light of what we're doing with the Mellon research and data project is, how can we imagine or maybe see some of these techniques helping with this concept we've already talked about of assessing student outcomes, authentic assessment, and this idea of academic rigor in a way that is both actually useful to do at scale in the future, but also useful to help our colleagues reimagine what rigor is and what the student experience is. Very big question, but
yeah, well, I think for me, thinking about academic engagement, taking academic engagement much more seriously is a way into that conversation. And so, again, in our analysis at UCI and the LMS data, we have measures of academic engagement. How many times do students click on to the LMS site to access course material? How many hours do they spend engaged in that the LMS platform? Obviously, it's an imperfect measure, but we know from prior research that time on task is a strong and consistent predictor of student outcomes in any educational setting. And so thinking about academic rigor in terms of how do we design the curriculum and instruction to optimize academic engagement and academic engagement across all students. And again, that's no assurance academic engagement that learning and occurs, but it's probably a critical condition for to see the development of those competencies.
Yeah, no, I like that, Richard. I'm going to make a quick comment to some things I saw go by, about how we're doing some of this at UCI, some of this implementation. We have a very nice situation where we have a lot of researchers engaged in the Mellon project. And Richard, you can maybe mention the numbers when I finish. That's helping build awareness. But just this year alone, a few practical things we've done out of my office. We created a Canvas course space for faculty to discuss exactly the issues we're raising here. I wrote a short reflection piece for each of a series of discussion questions. We have roughly 70 or 80 faculty who have signed up for that Canvas space. 15 or so are making regular comments, but the others are reading their colleagues' comments and doing that. I've held 2 town halls as vice provost. We've had roughly 60 faculty register, many of them not the usual suspects who show up for a teaching discussion, really engaging around grading, very hungry for data, being made aware of what we're getting out of the Mellon project and our other data areas. Our plan is to leverage a number of faculty learning communities have emerged on campus, either naturally around remote learning because of their concerns with being able to do that, or around anti-Black racism because of UCI's Black Thriving Initiative, or institutional racism in general. We're going to engage those communities winter quarter to have these as topics of discussion, and then hopefully move into the department faculty meetings in the spring. So lots of places for this conversation, which I saw mentioned there. Leveraging faculty learning communities is a big thing. But I want to, having made that comment, Richard, I think close in our last 5 or 10 minutes. Colin posted what I think is one of the real critical discussion questions around data.
Can you hold it for one
Sure,
second? Because I want to push you to talk about something, one other thing for
definitely.
Because you know, I've been was really impressed by the work that the provost office at UCI did in conjunction with you about changing the tenure and promotion guidelines to require a second piece of evidence around teaching. Do you want to, can you share a little bit of that as kind of a mechanism that kind of can be built in to?
No, thank you. Work. Yeah, thank you, Richard. So yeah, and I'll give a shout out to Diane O'Dowd, who really started that. And it was really interesting because she basically noticed it was a requirement in the policies that wasn't being used, and has, with the provost and with our CAP, our Senate Council for Academic Promotion, really institutionalized the need for that second piece of evidence beyond just, say, student evaluations. And where we've moved sort of naturally through that process is self-reflective teaching statements by the faculty that our unit helps faculty consider, right? We provide examples of how to do that. We help them with data, and that having that second piece of evidence and enforcing it quite rigorously in the promotion tenure process really helps move this conversation forward. So yeah, thank you for pointing that out. And then I think for our last question is this idea, I think you saw Colin's post hopefully in the chat, and it's also in the question, but basically how do we balance the benefits from this without becoming either paternalistic and over surveillance? But I would also argue, how do we avoid creating another sort of, to be blunt, racist structure, right? How do we move, you know, out of the structure we have now to an actual structure that's better? And like Colin said, though, a piece of that is how do we avoid becoming overly paternalistic and just reinforcing expectations in the students through the data that we don't want to reinforce?
Yeah. So I think one way to think about that is that it's likely going to be counterproductive if these reforms are kind of implemented on the system as a whole from the top down. I think the way to do this work is to put faculty front and center. You know, faculty, it's you have to respect their expertise as professionals and put them in have them work collaboratively to address these issues by being more intentional about the structures that are in place and using data to make sure their approaches are evidence-based and improving outcomes. And then around the table, of course, should be students and other stakeholders to inform and ground the work. But frankly, in many colleges and universities, faculty are not being asked collectively to take on this work. Sometimes they're being asked to work on improving instruction in their individual courses, sometimes to engage in accreditation processes at the department level, but really to kind of empower and incentivize faculty to work in an inclusive way with diverse stakeholders to take ownership for this work and be more intentional about improving outcomes. And again, I think the measurement can help drive that, because if you put in front of faculty the fact that the dropout rates are so high that the people are leaving the institution, they're leaving often the STEM majors. I believe faculty care about students and student learning and student outcomes. And if they're made aware and made to confront those realities, I think that helps us move the needle a little bit. Michael, what do you think? Because I know you've been
Richard, I'll
worried
add to
about
that. Yeah, something you said that really struck. So we just recently completed a survey of STEM faculty, and we're just starting to analyze the data. And one of the most interesting things is the vast majority of them, when asked, effectively, do you think students should have the opportunity to be as successful as possible in the major they want to do? The vast majority agreed strongly or agreed with that statement. Whereas if you were to ask what the actual behavior in STEM is and what the assumption about STEM faculty are, is that, well, we're really about keeping students out. We're about being gatekeepers. You know, we have high fail rates. And the reality is we only retain like 40% of the students that declare our STEM majors initially. So I think presenting faculty with the results of their own beliefs, which is, well, we believe we're here to help students, and the reality of the outcome that 40% of them is all that you're retaining, 60% are leaving. I had a colleague years ago when we were discussing intro physics issues, and the grade said, look, we basically have three choices. We can continue to complain that students aren't learning what they should, but give slightly higher grades because we don't want to look bad to the university. We can actually, keep our narrow standards and teach exactly the way we've been teaching and fail more of them. Or we could admit the fact that maybe to have students be successful, we have to change how we teach, right? Facing this data, we know these are really talented students coming into UCI, and we should be able to teach them. And I think what I've seen at UCI, it's fascinating. One of the few sort of bright sides of the pandemic and going remote is everybody's been faced to have to think about their teaching, at least at some level. And many people are asking the question, oh, wow, or being challenged with, you are bright, the best and the brightest supposedly of the world. Can't we be creative enough to figure out how to redesign curriculum structurally so that these students can be successful? It's an exciting question to ask. Aren't we the right people to do this? And I think faculty get excited.
And I think the way institutional racism often works is that it's invisible, it's embedded in the system. And so part of the solution is making it visible. And, I go back to kind of W.E.B. Du Bois, who used the social survey in Philadelphia to identify the social and economic conditions of African Americans in Philadelphia 100 years ago. And it was making that information visible that showed the inequalities that existed, that demanded social and public address. And that's, again, I think the same thing has to happen on our own campuses. We often don't think about what happens to the students that end up with a D in our class.
Right.
And when it's the institution's responsibility to show faculty, well, this is what happens to those, that 10-15% of students that ended up with a D or an F or an incomplete in your class, a withdraw. This is where they were 12 months later.
Yeah.
And here was the difference in their social backgrounds. And again, making that visible has to be a part of kind of coming to terms and reckoning with the institutional racism that exists on our campuses.
Yeah, and just, I think I'll close with a specific example from UCI, Richard, where we looked at finally the data of change of majors by race, ethnicity, income, first gen, and not to pick on my colleagues in chemistry, but in the chemistry department, we noticed that independent of grades in the courses, when students left chemistry and changed majors, students of color went to social science, and other students went on to bio or pharm sci or public health. And I'm not judging the quality of what those decisions or which is right or wrong, but it made us realize that there probably is something structural in here, that if there is such a difference in behavior and choice of major, it's not just about the students. It's something we have to find out about our structures and then decide if those are structures that are contributing to the problem or not. And they're invisible until you know they exist, right? And then you have to actually ask the hard questions, figure out what they are, and do something about them. So I notice, Steve, I'll bring you back because we're at 10:59. I think we got to most of the questions in some form or another. Is there any last minute things you would like us to do, or?
No, if you don't mind, I just want to thank all the participants who joined this town hall today and thank them for their questions and for the materials they've posted in the chat and Q&A. And on their behalf, as well as on behalf of the Reinvention Collaborative and all our university members, thank both of you, Richard and Michael, for a very stimulating and informative, grounded approach to a topic we all agree is of the utmost importance and a challenge for all of us. And you've helped us think through a lot of the issues today, and we're very grateful to you. So thank you all, and we hope everyone will share this recorded video widely because we all need to listen to it.